what we are going to talk about today. We're going to start with what I call kind of, Unit 2 for the stomach. So we're basically going to talk about cephalic, gastric and intestinal phases for the regulation of the stomach activities. Okay, so here's what I'm referring to. So basically, we want to take a look. What stimulates and what inhibits stomach activities in 3 phases of digestion: the cephalic phase, the gastric phase, the intestinal phase. So look at this. Cephalic phase refers to the stimuli that come from the head, right? Overall. So what are those stimuli? We can have taste of food, smell of food, right? Try to set some boundaries. Okay, taste, smell, sight. All of this will stimulate the digestive activities, and I want to stress it out, in the stomach, right? So when you start eating, it already stimulates production of gastrin. Gastrin stimulates parietal cells, and parietal cells will produce hydrochloric acid. Now, the inhibitory part here will be things like depression or lack of appetite. Does that make sense? So obviously, you don't want to eat when you're depressed. Then you have gastric phase. Gastric is pretty straightforward. Okay? So if you think about it, distension, when food ends up in the stomach, and increase in pH. Which basically means when food enters the stomach, the pH in the stomach. All right. I hope finally, food gets into the stomach, which dilutes the acid, which increases pH. So increased pH works as the stimulus for more active intestinal digestion, for release of acid, for gastric contractions, release of acid into the stomach lumen. Does that make sense? Good. Obviously, inhibition in this case will be something in the line of, decreased pH. So counterintuitively, if you basically, what I'm trying to tell is that if you drink acidic drink like Fanta, for example, it will technically decrease the gastric activities because it's already, pretty acidic. It's about pH 2 or 3. Makes sense, right? Now, intestinal phase is interesting because if you think about this whole, digestive system, you have, so duodenum, intestines, they receive food, so to say, right, from the stomach. And it's really interesting how presence of food in the intestine influences digestive activities. In the short term, entrance of the fatty semi-digested food, which is called chyme, okay, will stimulate digestion. Let me explain. Short term. So basically what I'm trying to tell you is this. When food goes from the stomach into the intestine, in the very beginning, the presence of food in the intestine and the duodenum serves as the stimulus for more vigorous stomach digestion. If I'm intestine and you are a stomach and you give me something, in the beginning I tell you, give me more, give me more, give me more. Does that make sense? The whole idea.
So the fatty chyme is not, it's staying in the, like the presence of fatty chyme in the stomach is
In the intestine.
I thought we didn't want chyme in the,
Oh, we do, because, okay,
or acid, so acid is also in the,
of course, it's inevitable.
okay.
Acid that is produced in the stomach will enter intestine no matter what. It will be neutralized eventually, but it does enter. So you have two main chemical stimuli, acid and fat. Correct?
Yes.
Are you following me? Acid and fat in the intestine in a short-term period, so to say, will stimulate gastric digestion. It will increase the motility, so more chyme can get into the intestine. Does that make sense? So the analogy that I usually use, if I'm the intestine and you're the stomach, when you start giving me chyme, I tell you, give me more, give me more. Does that make sense? But eventually I become a little bit overloaded. So exactly same stimuli, presence of food in the intention, in the intestines, in the long-term run, is inhibitory. Does that make sense? So, I mean, analogies are, I really like, sort of, I paraphrasing one statement, all analogies are wrong, but some are useful. Okay, so imagine that somebody, that I don't know, you give me a meal, okay, food, and you keep loading it on the plate, and I tell you, give me more, give me more, give me more. But then at some point, I'm going to tell you, stop, enough, I need to deal with what's on the plate. So intestinal regulation of gastric activities is exactly like this. In a short-term perspective, intestine tells stomach, give me more. So stomach works more actively. And then after some time, stimulus changes to slow down body, closing pyloric sphincter, okay, chill, I need to deal with what I already have. Does that make sense?
So is the intestine essentially getting filled with?
It's not really filled. There's such a small amount of chyme that gets into the duodenum that it's entirely spread over the walls. To some extent, yeah, to some extent you can think of it as being filled, but it's not like you have a giant lump of food moving through your intestine. No. Does that make sense? So this whole regulation, and this is probably the most complex regulatory network, so to say, because you have two types of stimuli, stimulation and inhibition, coming from three different anatomical locations. Does that make sense? Now, we good? Another piece of information, is the way stomach generates acid. And this is really a critical introduction because you will see that this way of generating acid or base is the main way to create a particular, solution in the body. So this is the parietal cell. On this side, here, you have a blood vessel, okay? And on this side here, you have lumen of intestine. Not intestine, sorry. Lumen of the stomach. Okay? So first let's deal with the situation, how do you make an acid period? So check this out. The only molecule that we have in abundance in our body that can change pH is carbon dioxide. It's an acidic gas. So carbon dioxide diffuses from the blood, and you imagine we have an abundance of CO2 in the blood, right? So CO2 ends up in the parietal cell. Cytoplasm of a parietal cell is mostly water. So CO2 readily interacts with water, okay, producing carbonic acid, okay. So this is the very unstable molecule, and it dissociates into a proton and bicarbonate an ion. So in case of parietal cells in the stomach, our target ion is hydrogen ion. Does that make sense? So bicarbonate is being pumped back in the blood just because we don't need it. And hydrogen has to be moved into the lumen of intestine. This is where acid is present. Does that make sense? Now, question that I ask all the time. Well, two questions actually. Hydrogen ions, can they move across the cell membrane by themselves without any aid, like directly through the membrane? Can they do simple diffusion? No, they charged. Remember?
Because they were small enough, they could.
If we want to be completely pedantic, they can leak a little bit.
Okay.
A little bit, yes. There is some leakage. But here's another problem. Without any other sort of introductions or hints, this hydrogen ion that's in the parietal cell, will it be pumped into the lumen or will it diffuse?
It'll have to get pumped
Why?
because it's polar, trying to cross a non-polar membrane.
Diffusion can happen through the channel or carrier, right? But you're right, it has to be pumped.
To make energy, to like,
Much simpler. What is the normal pH? Neutral.
so
What about lumen of the stomach?
it's lower.
So which means it's what?
Higher.
Yes.
Acidity.
It's higher concentration of hydrogen ions. So it has to, if you think about it, the pH of cytoplasm is maybe 7.3, 7.4, okay? The pH in the stomach, very conservative, is 3. So you have to move against difference in 4 pH units. And if you remember your chemistry, difference in 4 pH units, it's 10,000 times difference in concentration. It's an enormous gradient. And the proton pump actually pumps hydrogens into the lumen of the stomach. Does that make sense? So, you're familiar with the drugs like Prilosec?
Yes.
It's a proton pump inhibitor. When people have gastroesophageal reflux, it can be due to the increased acidity. It also can be due to some intrinsic problems with the gastroesophageal sphincter at the bottom of the esophagus, top of the stomach. But one of the ways to treat it is just to reduce the acidity, right? And you basically just inhibit the pump, so it doesn't pump more hydrogens. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yes.
It's a pretty elegant way here. So I think we went over the Gastrin Production. So we figured that you have things like decreased acidity and distension will increase gastrin production, right? I'm gonna give you a quick reminder so you know. Basically, this all falls in line into increased pH or distension, gastrin by G cells, produced by G cells, stimulates histamine produced by ECL cells, which stimulates hydrochloric acid from parietal cells, and pepsinogen from chief cells. Just as a reminder.
Is it, so the increase in pH, so there's food that comes in which initially
Neutral.
dilutes the acid, but then we produce more acid,
Mhm.
which is why it's increase in pH.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
As an initial stimulus.
Okay.
And technically, when I was a kid, you know, really liked soda, especially Fanta. And like drinking Fanta after the meal turns out it's physiologically wrong, right? Because you eat something, you want it to be digested. So you definitely should not add acid because that would actually decrease your digestive stimulation.
Okay.
Make sense, right? So like, you know, increased acidity will inhibit digestive activities, including gastrin and histamine. Now, in terms of stomach pathologies, we're not talking much about them. Well, cancer, yeah, of course, there's cancer for everything. Peptic ulcer is a problem, right? And in peptic ulcer, there's a bacterium that infects epithelium in the stomach, and that results in a wound, an inflamed wound. And the biggest problem with peptic ulcer is if it's untreated, it can actually erode the wall of the stomach, resulting in the perforating ulcer, and that's a very, very dangerous condition. Okay, very treatable. Antibiotics and proton pump inhibitors. Does that make sense? Awesome.